Well, greetings and welcome to episode 51 of Bible 180, 180 episodes between Genesis and Revelation. We have just finished up on Psalms. Now we're going to go to a couple sessions, two of them, to Proverbs. Psalms, Proverbs kind of go together. They're next to one another in the Bible, and we'll transition back to 1 Kings and Solomon by episode 53. So, Proverbs 3, there's a wonderful verse in there that says, "Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make your paths straight." It's a wonderful verse from the book of Proverbs, and Proverbs is kind of an interesting book of the Bible because it's a series of short, concise statements that convey moral truths, though they're not necessarily complete thoughts. They're kind of one-liners that apply to certain situations in varying ways, but sometimes don't grasp the intensity or the gravity of a situation because they don't always deal with the intricacies of moral ambiguity, but in generally they give us a quick and easy way to think about how we make judgments in life. Proverbs are that we live by are not always biblical, but you know Proverbs that we every once in a while refer to as to making decisions, like honesty is the best policy, or those who live in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, or a bird in the hand is worth two in the bush. Two heads are better than one. Rome was not built in a day. Better late than never. All that glitters is not gold. Look before you leap. Step on a crack and you'll break your mother's back. I mean, they all make sense. And in generally, those are proverbial sayings by which we live. But there's an important distinction between good and secular proverbial advice and biblical wisdom or biblical proverbs. Biblical proverbs help us to be skillful and successful in our relationships and responsibilities by following God's principles in a moral universe. Biblical wisdom or proverbs presume that the person knows that there's a God and that this God is a creator of all things and that God put in us a certain spiritual DNA that knows there are moral laws that run this world. There's moral justice that eventually, in the end, tells us that the righteous are rewarded, and eventually, in the end, the wicked are judged. Biblical wisdom or proverbs are not dependent on a person's education or IQ because it's a matter of moral and spiritual understanding. Biblical wisdom or proverbs has to do with character and integrity and values, looking at the world through the grid of God's truth. Now, the book of Proverbs was written by King Solomon, who was the wealthiest man in the Bible in the world at that time. He was also the wisest person in the Bible. We're going to return to Solomon by episode 54 and kind of go back to 1 Kings and follow our way through with that. King Solomon was the son of King David. He was anointed by David to be his successor. And additionally, King Solomon is kind of a quiet Old Testament major author. He wrote wisdom down in Proverbs. He also wrote much of Ecclesiastes and the Song of Solomon. And there's a lot of biblical wisdom in the Proverbs. Reading through there's a lot of things to live by, kind of like pearls on a string, sometimes unconnected, because Proverbs doesn't really connect a line, but there are pearls of biblical wisdom. For instance, an intelligent person aims at wise action, but a fool starts off in many directions. Or in Proverbs, it's stupid to waste time on useless projects. Or we should make plans counting on God to direct us. Or anxiety weighs your heart down. Or a relaxed attitude lengthens your life. Or being cheerful keeps you happy. Or it's a slow death to be gloomy all the time. Or reverence for God adds hours to the day. Or our verse that we're talking about today from Proverbs 3. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not rely on your own instinct. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Now, King Solomon in 1 Kings was Israel's third king after the wicked King Saul, and then the good King David rose to power, and then, as we saw, fell from grace. When King David had grown old and feeble, when it was obvious that his reign of the king of Israel was about to come to an end, he anointed Solomon, his son, to be the next king. And at that point, man, the kingdom of Israel was in great shape. They didn't have national debt. The nation was strong and prosperous financially, and they were at peace after being at war for many years. Things were really good in Israel. And if there was ever a time to be the king of Israel at a good time, it was this time when Solomon became king. He had prosperity, he had popularity, he had peace, and things were going fabulously well for him and the people he ruled. And on top of that, God, who can literally do anything, came to Solomon and said, Solomon, whatever you want is yours. No boundaries, no rules, nothing is off the table. Ask for anything you want and I will give it to you. And even though Solomon was a teenager at that time, he had just gotten his driver's license, God asked him that, and Solomon asked for wisdom. Solomon said to God, give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people, to distinguish between right and wrong. Give me wisdom. He asked for wisdom. He could have asked for anything, but he asked for wisdom to govern God's people. And God responded by saying, Solomon, I will give you a wise and discerning heart so that there will be never anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I'll give you what you have not asked for. I'll give you riches and honor so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. And if you walk in my ways, note, if you walk in my ways and obey my statutes and commands as David your father did, I will give you a long life. God says, oh, man, Solomon, I'm going to give you everything. Wisdom, fame, wealth, and if you live a faithful life, I will make it a long life. And Solomon prospered and shared his wisdom. He guided the construction of the first temple in Jerusalem for the worship of God. It took 7 years to construct that temple with 180,000 workers using the materials that his father David had gathered. And just as he promised, God gave Solomon wealth, status, and fame beyond belief. Solomon's wealth would make Elon Musk seem like a pauper. Solomon had a huge fleet of ships that went around the world, returning every 3 years loaded with riches to accumulate to 25 tons of gold. 1 Kings 10, we read these words. Solomon was greater in riches and wisdom than all the other kings on earth. The whole world sought an audience with Solomon to hear his wisdom that God put in his heart. Year after year, everyone who came brought gifts of silver and gold, robes, weapons, spices, horses, and mules. King Solomon's rule was the peak of prosperity for the people of Israel. Never before or never since had Israel controlled so much territory or benefited from so much trade. Never before or since had Israel known such greatness. It was an unbelievable time. But then the crash started. In King Solomon's heart, there came a point when Solomon started to get off course. He stopped acting on his wisdom. He stopped applying his wisdom to his own life, because wisdom is more than knowledge. Wisdom isn't just knowing something. Wisdom is something you do. Like in the book of James, when it says, "Who is wise and understanding among you? Let him show it with a good life by deeds done in humility that comes with wisdom." Wisdom is more behavioral than intellectual. Okay, you can know all kinds of things, but you got to do them. Wisdom isn't knowing the right thing, it's doing the right thing. Again, James says, be doers of the word, not just hearers only. When Solomon's life started to get off track, he did it in a spectacular way. And I don't mean spectacular good. Just like his father David before him, Solomon couldn't control his passion. He had 700 wives and 300 concubines. That's kind of like having a sex person in addition to your wife. And while his king father had many wives and concubines, at least, you can say that, at least David's wives and concubines were from Israel. They were from the home country. Solomon's wives and concubines were from other nations that God had told his people, don't intermarry with them because they're going to turn your hearts away from me. That's just what happened with Solomon. He turned his heart away from God. In fact, in 1 Kings, we read that as Solomon grew old, his wives turned his hearts after other gods, and Solomon's heart turned cold toward God, and Solomon did what was evil in the sight of the Lord. The story of Solomon is so tragically sad. He had everything going for him. He was flying high. He built a temple. He had the admiration of the world. Things were unbelievably good for him. So what happened? Well, did he wake up one day and decide to worship other gods and turn away from God? No. His crash course was much more gradual, like a frog that's put in warm water and brought to a boil. Solomon's heart grew away from God incrementally and brought him to an absolute low in his life and in the nation of Israel. You know, the same things happen with people. I've never met anyone who wakes up in the morning and declares to himself, I'm going to ruin my relationship with my wife and have an affair. I've never met anyone who goes to work and thinks, I'm going to defraud my employer today. Never met anyone who decides at lunch that he's going to become a meth addict. But I have met people who have done all those things. Each one would say that their downturn in life was gradual and almost imperceptible, that it happened slowly, and then one day before they knew it, they found themselves lying in the rubble of a life that had crashed. Now, in some ways, the story of King Solomon is pretty depressing. He's a guy who had it all. Anything was there for his asking, except he lost his heart for God. He started turning slowly, not paying attention to the things that would eventually harm him and draw him away from God. Solomon's fall from grace is as spectacular as his rise to fame, to power, to prominence, and wealth. It's kind of depressing. On the other hand, we can learn a lot from the life of Solomon. We fall into sin not because we don't know right from wrong, but we slide slowly down that slope that leads us away from God. We know the difference between black and white, but life is most often lived in the gray. That's why we need to remember the words from Solomon when his heart was right. He wrote, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not rely on your own insight. In all your ways acknowledge him, and he will make straight your paths. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. How many times have we, you and I, struggle to make sense of life's events, like all kinds of messes in life that happens, when things happen that are beyond our understanding, when we struggle to find a way to explain it away. Sometimes we get into the point when we think, what's the use? What we think, what we do doesn't make a difference. Solomon's words speak to us. Trust in the Lord with all your heart. All your heart. That means that Whatever is thrown in your path of life that you have difficult questions about, for which you have no solution, trust in God with all your heart, knowing that your insights only give you a small piece of the puzzle as to what life is about. And it's easy to trust God with some of your heart, like 50-50, 50-60%. And if you're like me, you want to understand more, know more, try to figure out. Trusting God with all your heart is sometimes a bit challenging when we try to figure out the way that things are. If we knew all of the answers to everything in life, we wouldn't have to trust God, but we don't. So we trust God with all our heart. God wants to bless us. That's a consistent message of Scripture. God wishes to bless us, and sometimes we have to be content with not knowing and just trusting. It's kind of like how airline pilots fly at night. They have lights on the wings. Their lights are to be seen, not to see, but to be seen. In fact, at night, the pilots can't often see where they're going. They've got a panel of gauges and instruments that lets them know where they are and where they need to go in order to follow those gauges. If you're flying through the mountains or a dark, cloudy night, you don't want a pilot with no directional beams or gauges. You want one that guides you in the right path. Our instrument panel is the Bible. Our faith in God is our guide. We may not be able to see or understand everything on our own, but we can find our way through our storms by trusting in the Lord with all our hearts, not relying on our own instincts, but in all your ways acknowledge Him, and He will make your paths straight. We might not know everything, but we know the God in whom we can put our trusts, and that is enough. You take care, and I look forward to seeing you in the next episode. Until then, make it a great day. Bye-bye.